This presentation discusses the development of instructional materials and media selection. My name is David Lewis, and in this ongoing series we're discussing the Dick and Carey model. Developing instructional materials is one step in this instructional design model. Specifically, this presentation discusses media selection tactics, and the learning theories behind media selection. Just a reminder here, we're here in the Dick and Carey model. This presentation discusses media selection, and this topic is somewhat complicated because there's a lot of learning theory that should be considered when developing instructional materials. Unfortunately, the Dick and Carey model does not discuss learning theory as it relates to media, and this step is a little bit vague. Therefore, we'll be considering a number of topics that are outside of our readings. But first, let's relate this presentation with the previous presentations in this series. You may remember this graphic organizer from a previous presentation. In that presentation, we discussed the first several steps of sequencing and structuring instructional materials, developing the learning components into a lesson, and choosing student groups. Media selection is the next step in this diagram, and this will be the central topic of this discussion and this presentation, both from a development perspective but also from a learning perspective. And ideally, media should be selected on how they help the learner learn. Now then, let's turn our attention to media selection and the media themselves. We often use media or multimedia in the development of instructional materials. By definition, multimedia uses a combination of different media formats, either text, audio, video, or visuals. But before discussing combinations, let's consider the formats themselves individually. Text is perhaps the most commonly used media format, but it can deliver instruction via the printed page or the web. The most economical use of print certainly is via the web. Therefore, many instructional designers are employed to develop web-based instructional materials. 10 to 20 years ago, this was not the case, and some instructional designers still have page layout skills necessary to develop print-based instruction. But this is not the norm today. Now, let's consider text from a learning perspective. If you think about it, text is very useful for conveying information, but reading is a learned skill, and when reading, you're decoding visual symbols. So large amounts of text-based information can be somewhat cumbersome and time-consuming. Also, some abstract concepts are very difficult to represent with text alone. Imagine representing a square without a graphic. It would take far longer to understand this text description of this visual, while a graphic can immediately display a square to a learner. So visuals are better at this than print or auditory formats. Audio is another format often used in instructional materials. Recordings can often be developed into narrated presentations like the one you're listening to right now. In addition, audio can be used to deliver instruction via podcasts or in combinations with other media. Audio recordings also have their advantages and disadvantages, though. As a technology, audio creates a much larger file for download via the web. But network speeds have increased over the past decade, so that audio is no longer an issue for individuals living in the continental United States. But we live in a global society, and not everyone in the world has a high-speed internet connection. So be wary of these needs and provide alternative formats like downloadable files for those learners unable to listen to live or streaming file formats. From a learning perspective, narrative is the best type of audio format. Research has shown that sound effects and music are often a distraction and can even cause problems with learning. So avoid background music in your recordings. Visuals come in two main categories: photographs or vector graphics. Each of these requires specific design software and more time to produce than you might imagine. But they also have different uses. Notice both of these visuals depicts a man with a laptop, but the one on the right is somewhat more abstract. It's because it's a vector graphic, but it also emphasizes other ideas. Notice that it emphasizes time and the cityscape behind it. When choosing visuals, be careful to look at the whole graphic and make sure it's conveying the meaning you intend. Visuals also have their limitations. Years ago, we were worried about the rates of compression because of download speeds, but we're less concerned with the size and compression rates of graphics today. Now, from a learning perspective, it's important to consider the instructional value of visuals. Is that graphic really necessary? And does it have value to your presentation? Has it supported the learning in your environment, or is it just a decoration? If it's just a decoration, it's probably a distraction and should probably be eliminated from your instruction. Graphics are very useful for depicting examples, for instance, but they often have difficulty representing motion or abstract concepts like trust or justice. Video is a common combination of media formats and has its advantages and disadvantages. Bandwidth seems to be the biggest issue associated with video given web-based instruction. At home, you might watch a DVD, but instructional materials are often viewed via the internet. And while we all would love to download full-screen HD movies in our course, bandwidth issues prevent that. Full-screen high-quality video is still beyond most networks, but smaller compressed videos like those found at YouTube are becoming more and more acceptable. Some audiences outside the United States may be unable to view this type of instruction though, so be aware of your audience as you choose video. So which media is best? Well, the answer to that question depends on what you're really asking. Which is best from a media distribution perspective? Well, that's easy. Text is the easiest to distribute. But most people are interested in this question from a learning perspective. And this question is somewhat interesting, but probably framed incorrectly from a learning perspective. The answer to the question as it's written is none of the above. They are all equally good from a learning perspective. Studies have found no significant differences between them from a learning perspective. Some of you are probably familiar with the Clark-Kozma debate or the no significant differences phenomenon. From a learning perspective, Clark's argument is, and I quote, "Media are mere vehicles that deliver instruction but do not influence student achievement any more than the truck that delivers our groceries causes changes in our nutrition." Now, this is a very confrontational statement and probably hurt his argument more than it helped it. Had he followed it up with something like a cooking analogy with the idea that how we prepare our instruction is important, then people may have found that a little more palatable. But while many disagree with Clark because of their personal beliefs, they really can't argue with him from a logical or scientific perspective. So they really can't point to many studies that show a significant differences because there really aren't many. But people still intuitively believe they can learn better from one media than another. And on some level, they are actually correct, but it's not what you think. They may have learning preferences, but that doesn't mean they can actually learn better from, say, visual materials. The problem here is this question is really framed incorrectly. Rather than which media is best, it probably should read something like which media is more efficient. Now, that is a question that actually has a basis in the literature. And I even mentioned earlier that depicting a square is better in visual form than in print or auditory form. This is because they're different from a cognitive efficiency perspective. That is, learning here has time factored into the equation, but one actually takes longer than the other. And this is Clark's main argument. It boils down to efficiency. On some level, this discussion is really beyond the scope of this course, but I'll take a tangent here, especially since we're discussing media selection and we're discussing media in the context of learning. So let's investigate this idea here a little bit further. Instructional design is partly based upon communications theory. Communications theory speaks of an information source and the destination of that information. In our case, the source is the media and the destination is the learner. Unfortunately, people concentrate on the wrong side of this model to only think about the media. If learning is the goal, then they need to concentrate on the learner rather than the media. By the way, there is a biological basis for learning, so let's consider that for a moment too. First, our senses receive information from the environment. In this case, the media, and that information is converted into electrical signals to be processed by the brain and nervous system. When designing instruction, remember you're designing visual and auditory information to be understood by a learner's sensory systems, and these are represented in the brain and working memory as visual and auditory modalities. This information is reworked by our memory systems, both the short-term and long-term memory. By the way, what was once described as short-term memory is now called working memory. Memory is interesting, and if you think about it, your long-term memory is very deep. You can remember things that happened decades ago. However, as you're aware, the problem in instruction is not what you already know, it's what you do not know. So understanding new information as it is presented is the difficult part. To acquire that information for storage in long-term memory, you must interpret that information from the environment and process that information in working memory. Unfortunately, working memory acts like a bottleneck, limiting the amount of information that you can process and or remember at any point in time. Now, with that said, let's return to Richard Clark's argument. Now, he had described that media can be provided in various forms. You can describe a square in verbal form, as we discussed before, or in visual form. So you can describe things in many different forms of media, and the problem is learning is constricted by working memory. Now, this is the issue. Now, let's look at each of these media and think about what type of information they really are. First, obviously audio is auditory information, and video is actually a combination of auditory and visual information. But let's concentrate on each of these one at a time. As it turns out, text is a visual medium, and graphics are a visual medium. And combinations of text and graphics can cause the learner problems, especially when they're presented in quick succession. Unfortunately, many instructional designers don't consider which modality they're sending information through. or rather how that information is actually being received. So text and graphics are in the visual channel or modality, whereas a television show makes use of both auditory and visual modes. The reason Clark argued so strongly was he was aware of some research that had been conducted about the efficiency of instruction from a modality perspective. Clark was aware of something called cognitive load theory, and John Sweller here had described this theory of instruction. This theory is that learners have difficulties when time is constricted. So when encountering media, the learners are encountering a load either on the visual or auditory modes or both. What happens is a chunk of text and a visual are both visual forms of instruction. And according to this theory, providing instruction in these forms of or media simultaneously may confuse the learner because they may not know which to look at, and the memory load required to process these takes a certain amount of time for the learner to process. And this can confuse a learner, causing something called split attention. As you're aware, working memory is limited, and a learner can only process so much information in a certain period of time. And this is the real problem. The cognitive load involved in this kind of instruction can actually overload the learner and prevent learning. About 3 years after the Clark-Cosma debate, Richard Mayer here questioned all of this media stuff in an important article. He reframed the debate by asking, are we really asking the right questions? And Mayer thought this media methods debate was really misguided. He asked the question, shouldn't we be concerned with the learner and learning rather than the media involved? So he proposed something he called a cognitive theory of multimedia learning and published a book describing his research findings. Now, he based his theory in part on cognitive load theory, but also developed this theoretical framework based on his research. What Mayer found was something called the modality effect. Here are some graphics from one of his studies. What he found was words that are presented as narration are better processed than those that are presented as on-screen text. The idea here is that narration is a use of the auditory modality with graphics, which are the visual modality. This study found that those learners who received narration rather than on-screen text could retain and transfer that information better. Also, it should be stated that this study has been replicated many times, and this work is now widely accepted in the instructional design community. Here is how Mayer describes the modality effect. Typically, instructional media is processed via our eyes and ears and sensory memory, and then in working memory, to be held in long-term memory. But when we're processing text and visuals, we're reading words as a visual information channel by using our eyes. When we have to look at graphics at the same time, then that visual information channel may be overloaded. So by reading, we're converting words from visuals received through our eyes into auditory memory. And this comes at a cost, that of a higher mental effort, which reduces the amount of working memory available for learning. On the other hand, when we see and hear information with narrated multimedia, we are distributing that mental workload by using both modalities to process the information presented. This increases the amount of working memory for learning, resulting in improved retention and transfer. This modality effect was just one of the many learning effects found as a part of this theoretical framework. And as we've discussed, it all has to do with the limitations of working memory. So this modality effect, or even Clark's argument for that matter, holds for classroom-based instruction. The modality effect works here in the classroom because your words are heard through their ears, and if you present visuals, then they're using both modalities to perceive and understand your message. It even works online in this presentation. If you give the learners all the time they need to learn, well, media will probably have no effect and they will learn equally well. And that's what most educators do. They want their students to learn. However, as Clark argues, time is a factor when considering different modalities. And no matter what, learners never really have enough time. This is because learning is constricted by working memory. So Clark was correct to consider the efficiency of instructional materials. So this brings us to our conclusions. The Dick and Carey model doesn't get into this level of detail, so it does not discuss learning theory as it relates to media selection. As we have discussed, media selection is much more complicated than simply picking what's available given a delivery system. There's a lot of learning theory that should be considered when considering media selection. We've discussed communications theory as it relates to media, and in this presentation we discussed the load imposed by instruction, otherwise known as cognitive load. We also discussed Mayer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning, and finally the modality effect. Unfortunately, we just touched on these topics and theories. These are covered in much more detail in higher level classes like the Learning Theories class and the Advanced Instructional Design course. So take those courses if you want to learn more. Again, the take home message here is don't confuse the modality of the instruction with the media of instruction. And always focus on the learner and learning rather than the medium. Hopefully these all made sense to you. And if you want, review a slide if you feel you missed something. No matter what, I encourage you to explore these topics further on your own. Well, that's all for now. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.